Sandra Dee was more than Hollywood's quintessential good girl. She was a portrait of pain, masked by perfection. Born Alexandra Zuck, she captivated audiences with her angelic smile and innocent charm, but behind the glamour lay a life riddled with heartbreak. Controlled by an overbearing mother and thrust into stardom at just 12 years old, Sandra became a starlet in a world that cared little for the girl beneath the image. Her journey, marked by fame, love, loss, and self-destruction, reveals a story far more complex than the glossy facade she presented to the world. A story of resilience, longing, and the unyielding human spirit. Mary Zuck wasn't born a tyrant. She grew up in the shadow of the Great Depression, a time when dreams were luxuries few could afford. As a young girl, Mary had aspired to be an actress herself, dreaming of the stage lights and applause that would never come. Poverty and societal expectations tethered her to a different reality: marriage, domesticity, and, eventually, a daughter she viewed as her second chance. To Mary, Sandra wasn't just a child, she was a project, a living embodiment of everything Mary had been denied. "You're going to have the life I couldn't," Mary would say, brushing Sandra's hair into perfect curls before a photo shoot. But beneath the surface of these affirmations lurked Mary's own insecurities. Every accolade Sandra received felt like a vindication of Mary's sacrifices, while every criticism Sandra faced cut Mary to the core. Mary's motivations weren't entirely cruel, they were deeply flawed. She genuinely believed she was protecting Sandra from the harshness of the world by controlling her every move. Yet in doing so, she became the harshness Sandra needed protection from. At 8 years old, Sandra still carried the wide-eyed wonder of a child untouched by the realities of her mother's ambitions. On one sunny afternoon, while Mary was busy arranging a meeting with a talent scout, Sandra sat cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by crayons and paper. She had drawn a picture of a big house with a dog in the yard. Her idea of happiness. Mary breezed into the room, snatching the drawing from Sandra's hands. "What's this? You've got auditions tomorrow, and you're wasting time doodling?" Sandra looked up at her mother, confused. "I just wanted to draw our house," she said quietly. "This isn't your house, Sandra," Mary snapped, crumpling the paper. "Your house is wherever the cameras are." Moments like these chipped away at Sandra's innocence, though she still found small ways to cling to it. In secret, she would whisper to her dolls, imagining a life where she could be a kid like everyone else. But even her dolls weren't safe from her mother's influence. Mary once threw them away, declaring, "You don't need childish things anymore." As Sandra grew older, the line between love and control blurred. On one hand, her mother was her entire world, a figure who praised her beauty and talent, the architect of her stardom. On the other, Mary was the source of Sandra's deepest fears and insecurities. At 12, when Sandra was signed to her first contract, she asked her mother a simple question: "Why do I have to lie about my age?" Mary cupped her daughter's face in her hands, her voice sweet but firm. "Because they want a star, not a child. You have to be what they want you to be, Sandra." That night, Sandra sat alone in her room, staring at herself in the mirror. She practiced her smile, the one that made people call her America's sweetheart. But it felt foreign to her now. "Who am I?" she whispered to her reflection. Her mother's love felt conditional, tied to Sandra's ability to perform and succeed. Yet Sandra craved that love so desperately that she pushed aside her own needs and desires, convincing herself that her mother's control was an expression of care. But deep down, doubts began to grow. In rare quiet moments, Sandra would feel an ache in her chest, a yearning for a freedom she couldn't quite name. She began to wonder if her mother loved her, or the image of her that Mary had so carefully crafted. Sandra Dee's first foray into Hollywood was like stepping into a glittering world of dreams, a stark contrast to the controlled, gray monotony of her childhood. At 12 years old, she was the youngest person in the room during casting calls, surrounded by adults who smiled at her beauty, but rarely looked her in the eye. Her first encounter with the industry's darker side came during a wardrobe fitting for one of her breakout roles. A renowned male director entered the room unannounced, his eyes scanning her like she was a mannequin. "She's got the look," he said to her mother, barely acknowledging Sandra. "But those hips, tighten them up." Sandra flushed with embarrassment as the wardrobe assistant yanked the corset tighter. She wanted to cry out, to tell them it hurt, but she caught her mother's approving nod and swallowed her discomfort. The studio system treated her like property, a commodity to be molded, polished, and sold. Executives dictated everything from her hairstyle to her eating habits. At one point, she was put on a diet of boiled eggs and dry toast to maintain the figure they deemed acceptable. But the most unsettling moments were those when older male co-stars and producers would blur the lines of professionalism. At a press event for one of her films, a well-known actor leaned in too close, whispering compliments that felt anything but innocent. Sandra stiffened, her smile never faltering for the cameras. She had been trained too well. "Be grateful," her mother said when Sandra hesitantly mentioned the incident later. "These men are the gatekeepers to your success." Hollywood's image of Sandra Dee was as rigid as the movie posters that bore her face. She was the quintessential girl next door, the sweet, innocent teenager every mother wanted her daughter to emulate and every boy wanted to date. To maintain this image, Sandra had to uphold a strict facade. Studio executives fabricated her backstory, shaving years off her age and crafting tales of an idyllic, well-adjusted childhood. In interviews, Sandra was instructed to smile sweetly and avoid answering questions that veered too personal. The pressure to embody perfection took a toll. Behind the scenes, Sandra struggled with self-doubt and exhaustion. She was expected to work grueling hours, attending rehearsals, photo shoots, and public appearances, with little time to rest. When she began showing signs of wear, dark circles under her eyes, moments of uncharacteristic irritability, the studio's solution was simple: more makeup, more coffee, and a warning to pull it together. Sandra felt trapped in the role of Sandra Dee, a persona she didn't fully understand. Her attempts to assert her individuality were often dismissed. Once, she suggested wearing her hair in a simpler style for a film role, only to be told, "No one wants to see plain, they want to see perfect." The relentless demand for perfection seeped into her personal life, leaving Sandra with a constant fear of letting others down. She often wondered if anyone truly saw her for who she was, or if they even cared to look. Amid the isolating world of Hollywood, Sandra occasionally found brief moments of solace in unlikely places. One of her co-stars, an older actress who had weathered the industry's ups and downs, noticed Sandra's nervousness during a particularly grueling film shoot. "You're doing fine, kid," the actress said, slipping Sandra a piece of chocolate during a break. "Just remember, none of this is as real as it seems." Though the words were cryptic, they stayed with Sandra, offering her a small beacon of comfort when the pressures became overwhelming. Another ally was a kind-hearted makeup artist named Ruby. Ruby was a motherly figure, always ready with a kind word or a gentle hand when Sandra felt like she might crumble. On one particularly difficult day, after a harsh critique from a director, Ruby pulled Sandra aside and said, "You don't have to be perfect for them. Just be good to yourself when you can." These fleeting moments of kindness were rare, and Sandra often found herself alone in the sea of people who surrounded her. Still, they reminded her that humanity existed, even in an industry that often seemed devoid of it. Sandra Dee met Darin on the set of Come September, a light-hearted romantic comedy that mirrored the chemistry between its leads. Bobby, already a star with a string of hits like Mac the Knife, was charming and brimming with confidence, a sharp contrast to Sandra's soft-spoken demeanor. From their first meeting, Bobby seemed determined to win Sandra over. He sent her flowers on set, made her laugh between takes, and insisted that she join him for dinner after long shooting days. Despite her initial hesitation, Sandra was wary of her mother's disapproval. She found herself drawn to his magnetic personality. Their romance unfolded quickly, much to the delight of the press. Paparazzi captured their every move, dubbing them Hollywood's golden couple. Fans adored the pairing, seeing them as the epitome of glamour and romance. Bobby's boldness complemented Sandra's perceived innocence, creating a dynamic that fascinated the public. At their wedding, a small but star-studded affair, Sandra wore a delicate lace gown that emphasized her youthful beauty. Bobby, ever the showman, serenaded her with a song he'd written just for her. To the world, it was a fairy tale, but behind the glittering facade, cracks began to form. Marriage to Bobby wasn't easy. His towering ego, driven by a relentless need to succeed, often overshadowed Sandra's quieter ambitions. Bobby was used to being the center of attention, and his fiery temper made it difficult to navigate disagreements. One evening, during a party at their home, Bobby erupted in anger when Sandra excused herself early, citing exhaustion. "You're embarrassing me," he hissed as the guests pretended not to overhear. "You're supposed to be the perfect wife, Sandra." Moments like these left Sandra feeling small and inadequate. But there were also moments of tenderness that made her cling to the relationship. On their first anniversary, Bobby surprised her with a handwritten letter instead of an expensive gift. "You make me believe in things I never thought possible," he wrote. For a while, Sandra allowed herself to believe that love could smooth their rough edges. The birth of their son brought joy, but also new tensions. Bobby's career demands kept him away from home, leaving Sandra to navigate motherhood largely on her own. She found herself yearning for stability, but Bobby's restless spirit made it difficult for them to build a solid foundation. Sandra, raised to endure and please, tried her best to make the marriage work. She adapted to Bobby's moods, often putting her own needs aside to keep the peace. She developed coping mechanisms to survive the emotional turbulence, long walks in the garden, journaling late at night, and pouring her energy into raising their son. At times, she sought solace in her faith, attending church services alone when the strain of her marriage became too much to bear. She prayed not just for strength, but for the love that had once felt so effortless to return. Despite her efforts, the marriage eventually reached a breaking point. Bobby's controlling nature and infidelity created a chasm too wide to bridge. Their separation was painful, especially for Sandra, who still loved him deeply. When Bobby died unexpectedly at the age of 37, Sandra was devastated. Though their relationship had been far from perfect, she mourned the man who had once made her believe in fairy tales. In interviews years later, she admitted, "I never stopped loving him. Not completely." Her resilience shone through even in the aftermath of their marriage. Sandra carried on, raising their son with grace and trying to make sense of a life that had given her so much love and so much pain. By the late 1960s, Hollywood had moved on from the wholesome images of stars like Sandra Dee. Audiences craved grittier, more daring stories, leaving Sandra's once iconic roles to feel outdated. Offers dwindled, and her once busy schedule became a string of canceled meetings and unanswered phone calls. Sandra began spending long afternoons alone in her house, the silence deafening. She would flip through old magazines that once declared her the girl next door, tracing her younger self's smiling face with trembling fingers. One evening, Sandra sat at her vanity, staring into the mirror as she wrote in a small, leather-bound journal. Where did she go? The girl everyone loved. The girl who smiled so easily, who felt like she belonged. I look at myself now, and I don't recognize who I see. They don't call anymore. They don't care anymore. Maybe they never did. Her isolation deepened as she withdrew from friends and family. Even her son, who adored her, struggled to pull her out of her sadness. "Mom, are you okay?" he'd ask gently, and Sandra would force a smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart," she'd reply, her voice breaking under the weight of the lie. Sandra's relationship with her mother, Mary, remained a source of deep emotional pain. Even as an adult, Sandra felt trapped by Mary's influence. After her career began to falter, Mary's sharp critiques only intensified. "You need to get back out there," Mary said one day, her voice as sharp as ever. "Stop feeling sorry for yourself. You're Sandra Dee, for God's sake." Sandra snapped. "I'm not Sandra Dee, Mom. I never was. I'm Alexandra, your daughter, the one you turned into your personal puppet." Mary's face hardened, but Sandra didn't stop. Years of suppressed anger bubbled to the surface. "You took everything from me," Sandra continued, her voice trembling. "My childhood, my choices, my identity. You made me into someone I didn't even recognize, and now that it's all gone, I don't know who I am anymore." Mary didn't respond, and for the first time, Sandra saw her mother not as the controlling force of her life, but as a deeply flawed, broken woman. Though the confrontation didn't mend their relationship, it marked a turning point for Sandra, a moment of clarity where she began to understand the depth of her trauma. As Sandra struggled to cope with her fading career and unresolved pain, she turned to alcohol and smoking as temporary escapes. What started as an occasional drink to take the edge off became a nightly ritual. She often sat by the window with a glass of whiskey in one hand and a cigarette in the other, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The smoke curled around her like a shroud, the alcohol dulling her sharpest memories, but leaving an ache in its wake. One night, after polishing off a bottle of wine alone, she scribbled another journal entry. "The pain never leaves. It just sits there, waiting for me in the quiet. I drink to forget, but it doesn't work. I don't even know what I'm trying to forget anymore." Her addiction began to take a toll on her health. By middle age, Sandra's once vibrant appearance had faded. Years of drinking and smoking left her frail, her voice raspier, her movements slower. She tried to quit multiple times, seeking help through rehab programs and therapy, but the pull of her pain was strong. Still, there were moments of resilience. Her son remained a constant source of light in her life, often reminding her of her strength. "You're stronger than this, Mom," he'd say, holding her hand during her darkest moments. Though Sandra never fully escaped the grip of her addictions, she continued to fight. Her story became one of survival, a testament to a woman who endured immense pain, yet managed to keep moving forward, even when it felt impossible. Before Hollywood swept her away, Sandra had simpler dreams. As a little girl, she often sat on the porch of their modest home, a stack of library books beside her. She dreamed of being a writer, imagining herself penning stories about magical lands and brave heroines. She once confided this dream to a teacher who praised her imagination and encouraged her to keep writing. But when her mother overheard, Mary dismissed it with a sharp laugh. "You'll never make a living writing stories, Alexandra," she said. "You're destined for bigger things." Sandra sometimes wondered what her life might have been like if she'd ignored her mother's ambitions and followed her own. Would she have gone to college, married a kind, steady man, raised her son in a quiet suburb instead of under the harsh scrutiny of fame? In one particularly poignant journal entry, she wrote, "I wonder if I would have been happier as Alexandra. A small life, perhaps, but a peaceful one. A family that wasn't broken. A career that wasn't built on lies. I loved acting, but I don't know if I ever truly chose it. It was chosen for me, and yet I can't imagine who I'd be without it." Even as she reflected on these unfulfilled dreams, Sandra found solace in the fact that her life, with all its twists and turns, had moments of profound love and joy. She found herself cherishing the small victories, her son's laughter, the warmth of a good book, and the rare but treasured moments of genuine connection. In the golden age of Hollywood, the media played a crucial role in shaping public perceptions of its stars. For Sandra Dee, the press crafted a glowing image of the perfect, good girl. Magazine covers celebrated her youthful innocence and wholesome beauty, labeling her as the embodiment of purity in a rapidly changing world. Articles painted her as the quintessential all-American sweetheart, a girl who loved her family, avoided controversy, and embodied the ideals of an idealized 1950s lifestyle. Gossip columns buzzed with tales of her glamorous appearances, her whirlwind romance with Darin, and her seemingly idyllic life as a wife and mother. But the reality behind the headlines was far different. While the media showed a carefree starlet gracing red carpets, the real Sandra was battling deep emotional wounds. The pressure to maintain her pristine image weighed heavily on her, forcing her to suppress her struggles. The tabloids rarely captured the moments when Sandra would cry alone in her dressing room, overwhelmed by the demands of her career and the strain of her personal life. They didn't write about her quiet visits to doctors, desperately seeking help for the anxiety and insomnia that plagued her. Instead, they focused on her looks, her films, and her fairy tale marriage, never suspecting the pain simmering beneath the surface. For fans, Sandra Dee was a beacon of hope and happiness. Young girls idolized her, mimicking her style and dreaming of living a life as magical as hers seemed to be. Letters poured into studio offices daily, brimming with adoration and admiration. "Dear Sandra," one fan wrote, "you're the most beautiful person in the world. I want to be just like you when I grow up." Sandra often took time to respond to fan mail, her replies carefully written to reflect the image she was expected to uphold. She understood the importance of her role as a symbol of innocence and hope, even as it felt increasingly disconnected from her true self. On rare occasions, she encountered fans in person. One particularly poignant moment occurred at a charity event where a teenage girl approached her with a scrapbook of Sandra's magazine clippings. "You're my hero," the girl said, her eyes shining with excitement. Sandra forced a bright smile and said, "Thank you, sweetheart. That means so much to me." But as the girl walked away, Sandra's smile faltered. The encounter stayed with her, a bittersweet reminder of the disconnect between the person the world adored and the woman she truly was. Even as her star began to fade, fans continued to cherish her memory. Older women would tell their daughters about the movies they'd watched as teens, while reruns of her films introduced Sandra to new generations. For many, she was a symbol of a simpler, more innocent time, a legacy that endured despite the tragedies of her private life. Sandra Dee's life became a cautionary tale about the cost of fame, especially for young stars in Hollywood. Her story highlighted the pressures placed on child actors and the exploitation that often came with early stardom. As the entertainment industry began to reckon with its treatment of vulnerable performers, Sandra's experiences served as a reminder of the need for better protections. In interviews and memoirs, other stars of her era, some who had worked alongside her, spoke of the emotional toll Hollywood had taken on them. Many pointed to Sandra's life as an example of how fame could isolate and harm, particularly when paired with a lack of strong personal support. Her struggles also sparked conversations about the role of parents in managing the careers of young performers. The controlling influence of her mother, Mary, became a stark warning about the dangers of prioritizing ambition over a child's well-being. Today, her story is often referenced in discussions about child actors, serving as a reminder that behind the glittering facade of fame, there are real people with real vulnerabilities. Beyond Hollywood, Sandra's resilience left an impact on those closest to her. Her son, Darin, has spoken openly about his mother's struggles and their relationship. Despite her pain, Sandra's love for her son was unwavering, and he often described her as a woman who did her best to protect him from the darkness she faced. Through his efforts to honor both Sandra and Darin's legacies, her story continues to reach new audiences. Even with the tragedies that defined much of her personal life, Sandra Dee's image remains iconic. To many, she represents a golden age of Hollywood, a time when movie stars embodied the ideals of beauty, innocence, and charm. Films like Gidget and Tammy and the Doctor continue to be cherished by fans, offering a glimpse into the optimism and simplicity of a bygone era. In pop culture, Sandra's name remains synonymous with youthful innocence. Her portrayal in Gidget inspired generations of beach movies and romantic comedies, and her influence can be seen in countless modern depictions of wholesome, optimistic heroines. The song, "Look at Me, I'm Sandra Dee" from Grease, cemented her place in popular culture, though its playful critique of her innocence stands in stark contrast to the darker truths of her life. Over time, fans and critics alike have come to view her story with greater nuance, recognizing the strength it took for her to endure the challenges she faced. Sandra Dee's legacy is one of beauty and tragedy, resilience and vulnerability. She remains an emblem of a Hollywood dream that, for all its glitter, exacted a heavy toll. Yet, through her films, her story, and the memories of those who loved her, Sandra continues to shine, a timeless figure whose life serves as both inspiration and a lesson for future generations. If Sandra Dee's story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of her life resonates with you the most? Share your reflections or favorite memories of Sandra in the comments below. We're eager to start a conversation with you. And if you enjoy exploring the lives of Hollywood legends and uncovering the untold stories behind the fame, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Join our community today, and let's keep these stories alive together.